Bonjour. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am delighted to see how many people have tuned in from right across the country. On behalf of Children First Canada, who has a bold and ambitious vision that together we can make Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up, I welcome each of you today. My name is Natasha Morano, and I am the Manager of Strategic Partnerships and Events. Children First Canada is a national organization with speakers joining us today from Calgary, Ottawa, and Toronto. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, and the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation, Region 3, and all people who make their homes in Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. We also acknowledge the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin and Noshaway people, as well as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We are grateful to be gathered today to welcome the Honorable Ahmed Hussen, Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development, who will join our founder and CEO, Sara Austin, for a conversation regarding the impact of COVID-19 on children. We are also delighted to be joined by two young ambassadors from Children First Canada who have collected questions from their peers to pose to the Minister. Now, this will be an interactive event, so we encourage all of you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we are also pleased to have received so many questions from the registration process, and we will try our absolute best to get to as many of them as possible. Now, before I turn the screen over to Sara, I would like to extend a huge thank you to Cisco for providing us with the opportunity to hold this session on WebEx and for all of their incredible support to make today happen. So without further ado, it is now my pleasure to introduce a world-class champion for children and founder and CEO of Children First Canada, the amazing Sara Austin.
Well, thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you all for joining us today. We have an incredible group of nearly 200 folks joining us from coast to coast to coast, from as far apart as St. John's, Newfoundland, Halifax, Montreal, Kingston, North Bay, Whitehorse, Edmonton, Vancouver, and all points in between. We're really thrilled that all of you can join us. We have participants, I think, as young as 8, and I won't hazard a guess as to say who might be the oldest, but needless to say, this is an intergenerational conversation across our country about something that we all care deeply about, helping children and families survive and thrive throughout this crisis. Since the very early days of the coronavirus, Children First Canada has been working actively to try and put children on the radar and to really draw attention to the ways in which children and their families are being impacted by this crisis. In the very early days, we called together our Council of Champions with the heads of many leading children's charities, kids' hospitals, research centers, major corporate leaders that invest in kids, to seek their advice about the ways in which children were being impacted and to pull together a call to action, if you will, so that we could work together with the federal government and civil society stakeholders, and of course, kids themselves, to put together an action plan and ensure that we were working in the best way possible to mitigate the impact of this crisis on children. Together, we identified what we saw to be the top concerns facing children and youth across the country. And we worked closely with the Prime Minister's office, with Minister Hussen and many other ministers and parliamentarians to really put a spotlight on how children and their families are being impacted and to really mobilize urgent action. We know that kids have been impacted in a whole host of ways. They've of course been disrupted by their education and the closure of daycares. They've had loss of access to school nutrition programs, which are really essential to millions of children. There's been reduced physical activity because of not being active outside of their homes. There's been a significant impact around social isolation and children experiencing threats to their mental health and well-being. There have been concerns around access to even the most basic routine aspects of children's medical care, like maintaining immunizations and other routine aspects of childcare, but also significant medical care needed for children who have cancer or have other complex medical needs, as well as children who have special needs and who've had limited access to supports as a result of being confined at home. We know that as well that for many children, home is not a safe place to be. And there have been concerns around increased risk of family violence and violence against children in this crisis because of the increased pressures that families and children are experiencing, and because children do not have right now as much access to trusted adults outside of their homes. And while we know that all kids are being impacted in a whole host of ways, there are some kids who are particularly vulnerable right now. Kids who were living in poverty even before this crisis are struggling even more right now. We know that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children are more vulnerable because of the increased levels of poverty and the systemic discrimination that they faced before this crisis is being exacerbated by the current circumstances. We know that children in and out of care, children in the child welfare system, are being impacted by their ability to maintain family connections and even accessing the most basic of supplies right now. And so, of course, we're deeply concerned about the ways kids are being impacted, and we've been mobilizing quickly to take action. Through our Council of Champions, we released a joint statement calling on the federal government to invest $250 million in 3 areas of priority around protecting the physical and mental health of children, protecting children from violence, and supporting the resilience of children and youth. We're looking forward to hearing an update from the Minister today about what he and his colleagues are doing to support children and their families, and hearing more concerns directly from children and youth themselves, and people like Roman and Sagni, who are speaking out and taking action. And while we know that children and youth are being hit hard by this crisis, we think it's also worth celebrating the incredible ways that children and youth have been leading through this crisis. They've stepped up in countless ways as leaders in their homes, in their communities, and at a national stage. 6-year-old Callahan from Saanich, BC, set up a driveway joke stand to cheer up his neighbors. Children across the country have painted rainbows and created chalk art and made signs to thank our frontline heroes and send messages of hope to Canadians. Youth leaders at jack.org organized a virtual week-long mental health summit to support their peers. Youth with the Assembly of 7 Generations surveyed Indigenous youth in the Ottawa area and put together hampers to support the urgent needs that Indigenous youth have right now. Children and youth have organized themselves politically, meeting with parliamentarians and civil society leaders to bring forward their issues and their ideas and their concerns. You know, I could go on, and there's countless ways that we can learn from the ways that children and youth have been leading through this crisis and stepping up to make sure that their rights are protected. For me, one of the biggest lessons learned is that children are experts in their own lives, and they're often the first ones to step up and lead the way with creative solutions. And we're really thrilled to be able to celebrate that today. So on that note, I'm delighted to welcome 2 of our incredible youth leaders who will be with us and part of this conversation today. First, I'm going to welcome Sagni.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Sagni, and I am coming to you from Ottawa.
Thanks so much, Sagni. And we also have with us Roman.
Hi, my name is Roman Wolfley. I'm coming to you from Calgary, Alberta, and I'm delighted to be here today.
Thanks so much, Roman. We're really thrilled that both you and Sagni are with us for this conversation. Thank you so much. And of course, I'm very delighted to be welcoming our very special guest, the Honourable Ahmed Hussen, the Minister for Families, Children and Social Development. And so it's now my pleasure to turn the table over to the Minister to hear his remarks, to hear his thoughts about the ways in which the federal government is responding to support children and their families through this crisis. So welcome to you, Minister. We're looking forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I really want to thank Children First Canada for having me on today. And this is a really wonderful opportunity for me as the minister responsible for families, children, and social development to be here to join all of you. I want to start by really thanking you for all the hard work that you've been able to accomplish for children and youth in Canada. Not only during regular times, but especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been an especially difficult time for families and children, and you are stepping up to help so many of us in this situation. We all agree in this meeting that every single child in Canada deserves the best possible start in life. That is the philosophy that guides our government and our policies, and that is the starting point for everything that we do. We all have a common goal of making sure that we improve the lives of all children and all youth in Canada. We acted really quickly. As soon as the pandemic started, we acted quickly to provide additional supports for families and children and workers through the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. That is money going directly to families, supporting them through this difficult time. We also established the Canada Child Benefit in 2016 to help Canadian parents to be able to meet with the rising costs of raising children. That money, that Canada Child Benefit has lifted more than 334,000 children out of poverty. That is a huge, huge figure. And every child that has been lifted out of poverty means that they can look forward to a much better life than before the introduction of the Canada Child Benefit. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we've also increased our supports to families and children. On May 20th, on Wednesday of this week, we introduced a one-time additional payment of $300 per child for each family that is receiving the Canada Child Benefit. That is money that is going towards putting more food on the table, buying more clothes for the children, investing in activities at home while kids are not able to go to school. But in addition to that, on July 20th, 2020, we will also be once again increasing the Canada Child Benefit permanently to take into account the increase in the cost of living. So every July we've been doing that now, and this is the third year in a row that we will be increasing the Canada Child Benefit on July the 20th. In addition to that, we announced more money for Kids Help Phone to help kids and families stay safe. We've also increased our funding substantially to fight homelessness in the context of COVID-19, and that is also helping families who are underhoused or who are homeless to find a place to stay and to put a roof over their heads. Finally, we will be there for families through this difficult time. We are making sure that we continue to address the gaps that exist in the responses. You mentioned, for example, earlier that kids who are already vulnerable have been particularly hit during the COVID-19 pandemic. That is why we have invested $350 million in an emergency community support fund to support organizations, nonprofits, and charitable organizations that are delivering services and material to vulnerable populations, including children. And so that money is supposed to help those helpers so that they can continue to serve Canada's children among other populations. So that $350 million has also gone live on May 19th, and I'm happy to inform all of you that many of the organizations that will receive that money through the $350 million Emergency Community Support Fund are organizations that are helping children through this difficult time. And we know that that money will go towards not only helping those organizations do what they do best, but also increase their capacity to help even more children. So I'm pretty excited about that. I look forward to this discussion, and I really look forward to your questions and your feedback. And we want to make sure that as we make policy in Ottawa, that we listen to children, we listen to youth. That is why our Prime Minister created his own Prime Minister's Youth Council, so he could hear directly from youth on what their issues are and how to incorporate that in government policy. And all our members of parliament followed his example by creating our own youth councils. I have one that allows me to get the perspectives of over back to you, but I look forward to the discussion and your questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Minister. We've already begun to answer some of the questions that were on my mind, and that were questions that have been coming in from some of our participants. As Natasha said, we've had an overwhelming number of questions submitted in advance, so we're going to try and get to as many of them as possible. But as you're listening to this conversation, just encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar so that we can respond to your questions live as well. Now, Minister, you spoke about some of the investments that have been made in the early days, some of the great steps to support organizations like Kids Health Phone and the food banks, organizations like the Breakfast Clubs of Canada. And you know that as a Council of Champions, we've spoken out about the need for even greater investment. We've called for $250 million to be invested around the physical and mental health of children, the protection of children and their resilience. Can you say more about what we might expect in the days ahead as we move through this crisis, as we move, I mean, we still very much in many ways part of the emergency response, but also as we turn our minds towards the recovery efforts, what more can we expect in terms of supports coming for children and their families?
Absolutely. Happy to talk about that we have done in response to this pandemic is to get money out the door very quickly. That is why we moved really quickly to get money out the door to help organizations serving our homeless population. We got money out the door quickly to help Canadian families who had lost jobs, Canadian individuals and families whose jobs simply disappeared or who were laid off. We moved quickly to enhance supports to seniors and other vulnerable populations. So we have constantly said that we will be there for families and children. We've gone back to the drawing boards a number of times when we've been informed on how, despite our measures, there's still remaining gaps. One of the things that we've done with the $350 million fund is we're asking for disaggregated data upfront. We are asking the three disbursing agents to account to us on a regular basis the different services that they're funding and the different organizations that they're funding and the groups that they are targeting. And one of those groups is children and youth. And so we will be getting, very regular reports on the effectiveness of that before we respond with any additional supports. We have to see how these various different supports are working on the ground, the additional amounts in the Canada Child Benefit, the increase in the $350 million Emergency Community Support Fund, which I must note again is open for also organizations serving children to apply to. And in fact, we're encouraging them to, and we will track the progress of their uptake. And we have ways to ensure that if there's gaps in that and to ensure that those organizations serving children are supported through that fund. So we're looking at that analysis. There is a larger request from the entire nonprofit and charitable sector, including organizations serving children and youth, for more comprehensive supports from the government in terms of stabilizing that entire sector. That is something that hasn't been finalized yet. We are looking at that request. I have been speaking to the sector frequently, and myself and the Minister of Finance are looking at that proposal, but no decisions have been made yet.
Thanks for that update. I think one of the things that we've been acutely aware of during this crisis is that children and youth, they're everyone's responsibility, and that can be one of the challenges around that is the coordination between the federal, provincial, territorial governments, ensuring that we have everybody accountable and working together for a united response. I think one of our questions really is, how can the federal government play more of that role of the convening power, working with the provinces and territories to really ensure that no child is left behind, because we know there's such a patchwork of approaches around things like education, healthcare, access to the essential supports that children need to enjoy the fulfillment of their rights. And so, can you tell us more about that federal provincial?
You're absolutely right. I think one of the things that this pandemic has demonstrated is that Canadians expect all levels of government to work together. Canadians don't care about who's responsible for what. At the end of the day, they want us to work together to make sure that we deliver what they need to get through this pandemic and beyond, and to recover. And I just want to point out what I see as the role of the federal government. The role of the federal government is, number one, as you said, a convener, but also play a leadership role in some of these really important issues for children and youth. Let me give you an example. The issue of simply putting a roof over people's heads. Access to housing is critical for the positive development and growth of children. If you don't have a roof over your head, it's pretty hard to have a decent quality of life. And so in that regard, the government of Canada has taken great leadership under the National Housing Strategy so that we encourage and really play a key leadership role in pushing the agenda of ensuring that every Canadian has access to a safe and affordable place to call home. And in the context of COVID-19, one of the policies we had produced and pushed the provinces on is becoming even more relevant in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is the Canada Housing Benefit. Through the Canada Housing Benefit, the federal government has taken a leadership role, but the provinces are cost matching our investments to create direct payments to families who are, for example, in shelters or who are underhoused, so that they can find permanent housing that meets their needs and circumstances. And those families, of course, include children, young children who need a safe and affordable place to call home. That's an example of the kind of role that I see the government of Canada playing. The second one is early learning and childcare. There is no way we can talk about a recovery and a bouncing back of the economy and our entire society without investments and reinforcement of the early learning and childcare sector. You know that every dollar that goes to early learning and childcare and investments in that early learning and childcare for children, uh, it has been estimated that for every dollar of investment in that sector, society gets back more than $7 back. So those are really good investments. And one of the things that I think we have to continue to pursue is federal leadership to push the provinces and territories to have more of a Canadian framework to make sure that we have a truly affordable, inclusive, and accessible and quality childcare right across the country. And one of the ways to do that is to move forward on our promise to create a federal childcare secretariat and continue the investments that we have been making to create more childcare spaces so that every single child in Canada and every single parent in Canada has access to quality and affordable and inclusive and accessible childcare.
That's great. Thank you so much. I mean, we are really pleased and encouraged by the leadership that you and the government are showing on key issues that are instrumental to the health and well-being of children and the protection of the rights, housing, childcare. You know, if I may be so bold, you know, we would love to see that type of leadership on the whole range of children's rights and really see that national framework, a national plan of action to promote the full range of children's rights. Canada is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and has that accountability for all rights of children. And so, I mean, on that note, one of the rights that we are particularly mindful of at Children First Canada is around the right of children to participate and be involved in decisions that affect their lives. You know, you talked about the Prime Minister's Youth Council, and we've been really encouraged to see the ways that the Prime Minister and you and others have been speaking directly to children and youth. Can you tell us more about the ways in which you're listening to the voices of children and youth, involving them in decisions that affect them right now during this crisis?
Yes, so one of the ways to do that is to do exactly what I'm doing now, which is to talk directly to children and youth leaders live so that I can get their feedback on what we're doing, but not just answer their questions. And this is really important. I don't feel that I'm here just to answer questions, although I'm happy to, but I'm also here to seriously and respectfully take their feedback on where they think the gaps still are. We don't have all the answers in Ottawa. And so listening to them in these kinds of settings and in these kinds of meetings helps me as a minister and as a representative, as a member of parliament, to take their feedback directly to the government to say, this is exactly what young people across the country are concerned about, or these are the gaps that they have identified, and these are the policies that they support, and these are the additional things that they would like us to do. Secondly, in my own constituency of York Southwestern, we have a youth council, and we get feedback from them. The Prime Minister also has his own youth council. And then on top of that, in addition to this meeting, during the pandemic, I have been having virtual town halls and meetings with a whole number of different communities, including youth. So that's how I've been getting feedback, and I will continue to do that because I have found that it has been very helpful to me and it has enriched my ability to be a better representative for all Canadians, including children and youth.
That's great, thank you. Well, we certainly know when we involve young people and involve them in the decisions that affect them, that we get better outcomes. And I'm really encouraged by the ways in which you're modeling that through your leadership. And thank you for the ways that you're doing that, and your openness to the ideas that they bring forward. We have a couple more questions. I know there's just tons of pouring in the Q&A section here, and so I want to make sure we get to a couple more, and then I'm going to turn the tables over to Sagni and Roman in a moment. One of the themes that came up a lot in the questions we got leading up to this webinar was around this theme of the summer. It's coming on us full force, and parents and kids and youth are all feeling at their wits' end. What's going to happen once schools stop over the summer months? Thinking of children, youth of all ages, this is impacting children themselves, and what are they going to do for the summer, but also parents, and how can they return to their jobs if there's no childcare summer camps available. And so it's a theme we heard about a lot from a lot of parents, but we're also hearing about it from children and youth. Can you say more about what can be done in the summer months to support kids and their families?
Yes, thank you so much. One of the reasons we have provided that additional one-time payment of $300 per child per family that is receiving the Canada Child Benefit is to take into consideration the additional costs of having children not go to school and being in the house 24/7. So helping families use some of that money, if not all of that money, for additional programs and services for children while they're at home. In addition to that, the $350 million will support any organization that is trying to help families with children get through COVID-19 pandemic. And it is not just for delivering food and medicine, although that is of course very important, but it's also for the delivery of services, of educational opportunities, of other programs for entertaining the children, for teaching them life skills and social skills. In addition to that, we are working very, very closely with provinces and territories to ensure that as we reopen our communities, we do that in a very responsible way. And I can assure you that our government is going to be there to ensure that as we reopen, we get the feedback from populations that are affected, including children and youth and parents, to reopen in a very responsible manner, but to also help Canadians through that recovery process. Central to that, and you've already talked about that, is early learning and childcare. There is simply no way we can recover optimally or recover well without prioritizing and making childcare central to that recovery process. It's going to be very difficult. And so to talk to my provincial and territorial counterparts, ministers who are responsible for early learning and childcare. I've also been talking to mayors, municipal leaders, as well as the early learning and the expert panel on early learning and childcare, talking to different stakeholders, to talking to youth leaders about how does the federal government exercise leadership and bring resources, money and resources to that sector, so that as we recover, we provide that access to good quality, affordable childcare for children as their parents go back into the workforce.
Thank you. I know we've got a ton more questions that have been pouring in on the chat box, and a long list that I had received beforehand, and we won't be able to get to them all. So we'll thank you again, Minister, for being willing to answer some of these questions after the fact, and we'll be sharing all the answers with you folks via email and on our website and on social media in the days and weeks ahead. I think if maybe one final quick question, and then well, it's not such a quick question, but it's really around the cracks that existed before this crisis began, the lack of having a national plan of action for children and youth to protect their rights, the lack of a children's commissioner, the high rates of poverty and abuse that were present before this crisis. As we move towards the recovery effort and turn our attention to whatever the new normal will be, what steps can we expect from the government around things like the establishment of a commissioner for children and youth, or a plan of action to really move us to become a world-leading country for children to protect their rights?
There is a proposal from a senator to create a community for children and youth. There's a presentation of a private on that, and we're looking at that, and we're seeing how that's going to work with the Early Learning and Childcare Secretariat, and as well as some of the other bodies that we have in it. That the Poverty Council, Anti-Poverty Council that I have as a minister, that I have access to, includes one member in there who's a youth and who brings that perspective to the Poverty Council. So we have to examine how that senator proposal works with all these already established bodies before we make a decision on how to move forward. I also want to speak about how to help vulnerable parents. And unfortunately, we do know that in times of crisis, in times of pandemic, in times of these kinds of situations, the rates of domestic violence goes up, unfortunately. And that, of course, has a negative impact on children and youth trapped at home with an abusive parent. And we have invested an additional $50 million in women's shelters so that women fleeing domestic violence have access to a safe place, uh, a sanctuary away from that abuse with their children. We are also looking at investing in our investments in housing are continuing to make sure that we provide a safe space. Housing investments have a carve for women so that it takes into consideration women fleeing domestic violence with their children, especially, and prioritizing those investments. In addition to that, one of the conversations that I have been having with municipal leaders and others is to see how we can make sure that the people that we were able to get off the street and into temporary housing because of the pandemic, how can we ensure that that becomes permanent housing so that these families never have to go back to the street? And of course, that includes children as well. We will continue to listen to children and youth, get their feedback on the policies that work for them, including the possibility of a commissioner for youth and children. And we will continue to have their backs, invest in families, provide those additional supports as we reopen the economy. And central to that is early learning and childcare. And you can count on our government to provide that federal leadership to ensure that there are national standards. Because right now, part of the problem is that you can have really good quality, affordable childcare in one part of the country and then something completely different in another part. So it is up to the federal government to provide that leadership because it's the only entity that can have that view beyond the particular provinces. And so we will play that role and we will ensure that we continue our investments in housing, in childcare, in supports for families with children, and organizations serving children and youth.
Great, thank you. I just thank you for again just commenting on some of these real issues and the concerns around the safety of children and youth in particular. We've seen lots of comments coming in around concerns around family violence, violence against children, lots of questions being submitted about that. I want to remind any children and youth who are on the call right now that if you are in need of support, you can reach out 24/7 to our friends at Kids Help Phone by phone or by text. We've posted the information in the chat box, but you can go to kidshelpphone.ca for help, 24/7 free. It's there to support you. And also for the adults who are on the call, if you know of a child and youth at risk, it's always important that you act on your instincts. And so if you're concerned about the safety of a child, please report it to your local children's aid or child welfare agency. Or if a child is in imminent danger, please call the police. So on that note, I think given that we're talking about children and youth and we have young people here at the table, I really want to turn the tables over to them. We have with us Sagni Kuma in Ottawa and Roman Wolfley. Roman is a grade 7 student, Sagni is in grade 12, and they've been actively promoting their rights and working with their peers across this country. And I want to turn the tables over to them to ask questions that they and their peers have. So maybe we'll start with you, Sagni.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and it was great hearing from you, Minister. My first question is in regards to the mental health of youth. Is the government evaluating the long-term effects of this pandemic's closures on youth, particularly children and infants who have experienced severe disruptions in normal routine as well as youth who have experienced mental health struggles during these months of physical isolation. How would the government respond to the results of a study of this nature, since it does have the implication of affecting them in the long term, even beyond reopening?
Thank you so much for your question and for your leadership in coming to this meeting and really thinking about the importance of mental health supports for youth. It is something that we are taking very seriously. We have invested a substantial amount of money in our health budget to respond to COVID-19, to shore up our mental health supports for all Canadians, including children and youth. The At the very beginning of the pandemic, we transferred $500 million to the provinces and territories, specifically to be used to strengthen our healthcare so that we can respond to COVID-19. Part of that money is earmarked for mental health supports. In addition to that, the $350 million Emergency Community Support Fund is meant to serve to it is meant to be used by organizations that are also responding with counseling and other mental health supports for people who are struggling with COVID-19 related disruption, including children, especially children. And so, this is in addition to the money that we've invested in Kids Help Phone, $7.5 million. And so I'm hoping that out of that $350 million, a good percentage of that money, I'm hopeful, will go to organizations serving children, including organizations helping children and youth through mental health supports through this difficult time. And why do it's not just an empty hope. Why do I know that will happen? Because we have demanded that that fund be used to serve vulnerable communities and vulnerable populations. And we've put together a formula and an accountability measure to make sure that happens. So after the first 4 weeks of the fund, we will have a report to see how some of that money, not all, but some of that money has been distributed. And we will see for ourselves what gaps have emerged. And if after the first 4 weeks we notice that children's needs were not as addressed as we would have liked, we have the mechanism to readjust and fix that gap. So I'm very confident that the $350 million will help in that regard.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Roman.
Before I ask this question, I'd just like to say I am very appreciative for the opportunity to be involved in this webinar. So thank you to Sara and everyone at Children First, and Cisco, and of course the minister for being here to take these. So you often rely on extracurricular activities and community centers to take a break from a potentially stressful home environment. Has the government considered any socially distant options for youth who need a safe environment away from home to spend some time?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I think as we reopen the economy and we reopen society, those are some of the things that will happen, but it will only happen with the advice and the design of the public health officials. One of the things that we've done very well in Canada is we have listened to our public health experts. You never want to have a politician give advice on healthcare. Health advice should be given by doctors, yes? So we will be listening to our world-class health officials, public health officials, to tell us exactly how those programs will look like. Our job is to find the resources to support those programs, including the $350 million. But before we reopen our society, we're already funding organizations through that fund and other funds like the social partnerships, the social partnerships program with my ministry, to reorient existing programs, but to make them fit in a home environment. So for example, if kids used to come together to do activities, how can we do the same activities virtually while kids connect to each other virtually and do the same activities at home? So those are some of the adjustments that are being made. And as I said, if there's an organization or organizations serving children who have those ideas and who just need some money to implement them, they can get that money through the $350 million Emergency Community Support Fund and other funds that we also provide through my ministry.
Thank you. Sagni, you're next.
You. So I know we kind of touched on this a little bit already in some of the questions that have been asked earlier, but so I do understand that the government is allocating funds to help support daycares and summer camps as parents head back to work over the summer. But what is being done to ensure that children feel comfortable enough to play and be kids and be close to one another in these settings, while also feeling safe from any risk of contracting COVID or any illness from one another?
So you've pointed exactly what the balance has to be. The balance is between keeping people safe, keeping kids safe, while at the same time allowing them to be kids and to play and to have a fulfilled experience, a full experience in daycare and in the community centers. And that is where the health advice will come in. As we're always learning more about the COVID-19 virus. It's a very early situation. It's not a disease that has a long history. So we're always learning. And I think over time we will have a better understanding of the way this disease and this virus works. And therefore we will have better information to devise better ways to allow kids to be fully functioning in the daycares and the community centers, while at the same time keeping them safe. One thing that I forgot to mention in my remarks is that the government of Canada is providing serious leadership in making sure that the childcare centers remain open. One of the ways that we've done that is not only to keep the sector open, but to actually increase the number of spaces so that more Indigenous kids can have access to childcare. More kids from low-income families can have access to childcare spaces. More kids who are from disadvantaged communities. And so the government of Canada is investing $7.5 billion from 2017 all the way to 2028, so that we've created over 40,000 new childcare spaces that didn't exist before. And now we have a goal of also creating an additional 250,000 before and after school daycare spaces. But now with Corona, with COVID-19 pandemic, there's a need for even more support for the sector. And I have said very clearly, together with the provinces and territories, we will do whatever we can to support that sector.
Thank you. Back to you, Roman.
Thank you. Many regions across Canada have put forth plans about how our communities will attempt to reopen. But have youth been consulted in the making of these proposals? If not, how could they be?
That's a very good question. You have to. So one of the things I just want to tell you is that the plans to reopen have generally so far have only come from provinces, not from us. The government of Canada still doesn't believe that we're at the point of reopening. So we still think that we should be cautious and careful. And I don't think we're out of the woods yet. But there's 2 provinces that have spoken about reopening, and I'm not aware of how they put together their plans. And in fact, one of them, Quebec, tried to reopen, and then they postponed the reopening by another 2 weeks. So it's a fast evolving situation. I don't know if they've consulted youth and children, but I can certainly find out and get back to you through my team.
Thank you. Back to you, Sagni.
Thank you. So what is being done to ensure that we are reaching Indigenous youth who have significantly less access to resources and support? I know we did talk a little bit about the budget that's been allocated for supporting organizations that support youth. But is there an entity that's available to ensure that Indigenous communities are able to access available funding that you've mentioned, and to ensure that a portion of this funding is going towards specifically supporting youth, youth employment, education, and the health of youth in these communities?
Absolutely, yes. We just for your background information, we have agreements with the 3 main Indigenous organizations. So the organization representing First Nations communities, the Assembly of First Nations. We also have an agreement with the Inuit Tapirat Kanatami, which represents Canada's Inuit peoples. And then we also have an agreement with the Métis National Council. On all those three groups, we have transferred billions of dollars for the Indigenous peoples of Canada to design, implement, and run their own childcare system. And in fact, I spoke earlier in my remarks to you about how the federal government is committed to creating a federal secretariat for childcare. Guess what? We already have one for Indigenous early learning and childcare. So it shows that we were ahead with Indigenous peoples before we even create. We have yet to create one for the rest of Canada. So on the Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Secretariat, we have provided $1.7 billion to create childcare and early learning programs that respect the uniqueness of Indigenous experiences and culture and language, and it is completely in line with the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that's number one. Number two, when the pandemic hit, we've provided $305 million directly to Indigenous communities to strengthen their ability to deal with the effects of COVID-19 pandemic. Number three, Indigenous groups and organizations also have access to apply to the $350 million Emergency Community Support Fund. So they're not excluded from that. They can apply to that, as well as a portion of the $100 million that we've provided to food banks and community food programs. In addition to that, we've also provided additional supports for Indigenous communities to be able to shore up their healthcare systems, their access to testing, their access to personal protective equipment, to masks, to gloves, to hand sanitizers and all kinds of things, and even ventilators. Indigenous communities have been consulted on our approach to shoring up supports for children, for families, for youth. So we have been, from the get-go, Indigenous communities and their organizations have been central to the policy-making process to respond to COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks for that question, Zaidi. Just in light of time, we'll probably take one more question from Roman.
Thank you. Of special concern during the pandemic is our elderly community. Many kids and youth across Canada worry about their grandparents during the pandemic.
Yes. Yes.
Generational connections are important. How do you propose to protect and preserve connections between children and the elderly in a manner that keeps all involved safe?
We are, first of all, one of the ways to serve seniors is to recognize the challenges that they're facing. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently announced a one-time additional support, a total amount of $500 for seniors under the old age security and the guaranteed income supplement. So that is putting more money in the hands and pockets of seniors. We are also funding services for seniors, $9 million initial amounts invested in senior supports, but now also under the $350 million fund. In addition to that, as you know, we've introduced a Canada student grant of $5,000 for any young person who volunteers and works with any organization that is helping vulnerable people, including seniors. So for young people who are concerned about our senior population, they can choose to volunteer with one of those organizations and connect with seniors in that through that service. And the government of Canada will pay them an amount of $5,000 when they finish before September, before school starts. That's a way that we are recognizing their service. In addition to that, if they qualify for the Canada Emergency Student Benefit, they will be paid $1,250 a month and $1,750 if they have a disability or if they have children. And then on top of that, they can still get the $5,000 by September if they volunteer with one of the organizations serving seniors.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Roman and Sagni, for those excellent questions. And I want to thank you both for the ways in which you're leading with our organization and in your community, and the ways in which you're just making such a significant impact during this crisis and far beyond. So thank you for your leadership. I know we just have a couple moments left, so I just want to turn it back to you, Minister, to say any final comments that you want to share with our participants today before we wrap up.
Yes, absolutely. I really want to thank you and all the organizers of Children First Canada for putting this together. It is a real honor and a wonderful opportunity for me to connect with young people, to connect with all of you today. Your questions have been amazing. Your feedback has been incredible. I really appreciate the passion and the responsibility that you see the importance of us continuing to address issues that are important for children and youth. I can assure you that our steps that we've taken so far as a government will continue. We will continue to support children and families through this difficult time and beyond. We know that investing in children is the best investment early to give them the best possible start in life, to give them the best possible access to a safe and affordable home, a safe and affordable and quality childcare, and educational opportunities, and opportunities to serve others, including seniors and other vulnerable populations. We are supporting children through the whole full spectrum of their life in Canada, and we want to make sure that Canada continues to aspire to be a great country when it comes to ensuring that every possible child has the best possible start in life, but also has the best quality of life as they grow through childhood to youth and to adulthood. So I appreciate everything that I've heard today, and I want to thank you for your leadership, and I want to thank all the organizers for getting us together. And I also want to point out that this is just the first meeting. Happy to come back and do this again as we continue to get slowly over a COVID-19 pandemic and into the recovery process. So if there's a need to continue this conversation, happy to come back and continue to answer questions and get feedback from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Minister. We're, just really encouraged by the ways in which you have led through this crisis and made children and youth and their families such a high priority. Thank you for your openness to hearing directly from children and youth, from their perspective as experts in their own lives, but also as citizens with rights. And we're looking forward to continuing that conversation with you. We're going to have some exciting news to share in the days ahead about ways in which we're supporting children as citizens with rights to engage with political leaders and parliamentarians to bring forward their ideas and be a part of leading the plan of action to lead us through this crisis and beyond. So I want to thank you, Minister, for being with us today and for the many ways you've led us and our country through this crisis. I want to thank again Sagni and Roman for their contributions today and for the ways in which they give generously of their time throughout the year to support the work that we do at Children First, and more importantly to support the rights of their peers. I want to thank Cisco as our partner in hosting this forum for generously donating this platform and supporting us technically. I also want to thank all of you who've participated today. We've received an overwhelming amount of questions that have come in by email and text, and so we again want to reiterate that we will be providing you with answers from the Minister in the days ahead. Thank you again for committing to Minister to providing those answers so that everyone gets response to their questions. So we'll be sharing that in the days ahead with all of you. Again, I want to remind any young people who are with us today that if you're in need of support, please reach out to Kids Help Phone by text or phone 24/7 for support. They are there to help you. And also to remind us as adults to be that virtual village for children and youth, if you're concerned about the safety or welfare of a child, to please trust your instincts and act quickly. Thank you again, everybody, for participating today, for giving a part of your Saturday to be with us. Thank you for the ways in which you care and support for children and support their rights each and every day in your homes, in your communities, and across this country. You'll be hearing more from Children First Canada in the days ahead as we continue to advocate for kids and empower children and youth to advocate for themselves. We believe that we can make Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up, and it's going to take all of us to do that. So thank you again, everybody, for your time today, and we'll look forward to speaking with you soon. Have a great weekend. Take good care.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.